um, just a little background information of why this area of Central East Austin is an African American cultural heritage district. After emancipation, um, black people were 25% of Austin population. Today, we're maybe about 7.
I thought we were 5.
We'll see. And black folks lived all over Austin, and what sometimes people call freedmen communities.
Side.
And most of those communities don't exist anymore, but some names we recognize, like Wheatsville, which is just north of the university, Clarksville, which is in West Austin and Terrytown. There's Kitchenville, which is way south near Slaughter Lane. There was Masontown, which is around 4th and 5th and 6th Street, south of here. But there were a lot. And in 1928, the city of Austin the city council passed a master plan. And that master plan was an answer to what was then across the South, maybe even across the country, was to answer a problem. And that problem was the Negro problem. What do we do with the black population, and how do we keep that black population segregated from whites? And so a series of laws were legislated across the country, and they were called Jim Crow laws. And so in Austin, that looked like black people who lived all over the city were forced into what was then called the Negro District. And they forced people by denying public services in any other part of town. So you could only go to school if you were black in this area. You could only have running water if you lived in this area. Your trash would only be picked up if you lived in this area. So we are currently, as residents of Austin, we are now living in the legacy of those Jim Crow laws. So I want to point this out so people really understand how public policy really affects our daily lives, everyone's daily lives, for generations and generations to come. So we really want to be cognizant about the policies we enact. But at any rate, this area therefore became a booming cultural area for Austin's black population and for Austin, because in this area were Austin as the music center. This is where the music came from. It came from this area. 11th Street was a booming commercial area with nightclubs and music venues and restaurants. And so now we are in the midst of another transition. And that transition is no longer said as Jim Crow, but it's said as gentrification. So we're in the midst of that change. But in the meantime, we as the Cultural Heritage District, part of our mandate is to tell the story of Central East Austin, and to preserve whatever we can of the built environment, and to reanimate those public spaces as cultural spaces for African Americans and for everyone else who lives in Central East Austin. So what you're going to see today and experience today is a tour that we call it a generalist tour. There'll be some old stuff, there'll be some new stuff, there'll be some buildings, there'll be some architecture, we'll talk about people. But basically, we're going to ride through the neighborhood and have a lot of fun because it's a beautiful day. It's a beautiful day.
Blue skies, smiling Adolph, it seems. Anyway, though, we are here on San Bernard Street. Prior to this being declared or made part of the Negro District, included in the Negro District, San Bernard dates back to the 1870s, so it's one of the older streets in the city. And this street was originally settled by Germans. And not only that, but San Bernard has about 4 structures on this street which are registered as city landmarks, and some are in the National Register of Historic Places, such as Wesley United Methodist Church.
Right.
Wesley Methodist Church actually started out downtown. Wesley dates from 1865, so this year they celebrate their sesquicentennial. That's also the year too of Juneteenth, 1865. So sesquicentennial of Juneteenth and of Wesley United Methodist Church. Well, Wesley moved to 9th and Nature Street in downtown Austin in 1874, and they stayed there until 1929, when they moved over here to what became the Negro District. So they have been here on this street since 1929. That's their present structure. And 1929, the area began to change because of the Negro District. So Germans started moving out. There were once Germans in this area. There were Italians. There were Lebanese. Over at Oakwood Cemetery, which is the oldest cemetery, we're going to pass that. There were there was a Jewish section, Beth Israel Cemetery, kind of giving away the tour here. But just to let you know that this area was a very interesting area even prior to it becoming the Negro District. And already there were 2 institutions of higher learning over here for African Americans, Samuel Houston College and also Tillotson College. Now, these 2 colleges merged in 1952 to form Houston-Tillotson College, now Houston-Tillotson University. There were other churches in the area as well, such as Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so there were already some assets here that were, and also some freedmen's communities were located over here as well. So it was already an area where African Americans lived, but it was also an area where people of other colors and ethnic groups lived as well. Well, that changed after the Negro District became a reality by City Council in 1928. And so I want you all to take that in mind. And as Lisa said, realize that there are many, many cultural assets over here that and which affected not only East Austin, but also affected and culturally enriched the city of Austin and spread beyond the city of Austin to culturally enrich the state of Texas, as well as the United States and the world.
And so the state went about commissioning 2 black artists to create these sculptures, which they did. And there were 6 sculptures. And each sculpture was to represent some aspect of black life surrounding Juneteenth. And so there's the minister, there's the child, the educator, and for some reason, the 6th sculpture was a legislator. Well, at emancipation, there were no black legislators. And the sculpture seemed to resemble the black legislator who had commissioned the work. Seen. So when the folks from the state saw the collection, everyone was very dismayed about the 6th piece. And so all of the pieces sat in a warehouse for 20 years. And this past spring, Bernadette Pfeiffer, who's the curator of the Carver, worked with some state officials and got 5 of the pieces released and created this sculpture garden. And they also created this timeline along the side. So just take your time and walk through.
Because David Chapel Baptist Church was designed by an African American architect. His name was John S. Chase, John S. Chase was the first African American to graduate from the University of Texas School of Architecture, and that was in 1952. This was 2 years after the Sweat versus Painter decision, something we'll tell you about later on. But anyway, though, John Chase graduated in 1952, and he had a practice here in Austin, and he designed, his specialization was mid-century architecture. And he designed a few churches here in Austin, went on to design the law school libraries, law school buildings on the campus of Texas Southern University in Houston. He also designed a house right across the street there. We're going to point across the street, and you see the house there with the kind of a cantilever roof, and you see the green trimming. Well, that is the Della Phillips house. Della Phillips was an African-American businesswoman living here in Austin, and John Chase designed that house for her. And that house was the first house in East Austin to have an elevator. John Chase also designed some other houses in that particular neighborhood, which is called the Holy Cross Heights neighborhood, an African-American neighborhood for mostly professionals, and the Holy Cross Heights dates from the 1950s, the mid-1950s. And there are at least two other homes over there that are John S. Chase design. And you can see, and also mid-modern, you can see the outline, what mid-century architecture was known for. You know, looking at the clean lines of it. When you look at David Chapel Baptist Church, I like how the roof kind of slopes up, raises upward. Like, think about a plane, the nose of a plane, just leaving the runway, taking up in flight there. So let's say when you're in the sanctuary and you're praying, think about your prayers going straight up to heaven.
That's
So,
good.
a wonderful landmark. They had a steeple or spire. I don't know where the spire is. I hope that it's being renovated, but it had a rather unique pointed spire on it. Yes, also John Chase went on to design not only, you know, some of the buildings on the campus of Texas Southern University, but he also went on to design a parking garage for his alma mater, the University of Texas, and he designed an embassy in the Middle East also. In one of the countries in the Middle East, he designed an embassy.
Nice.
He was also one of the first, he was perhaps the first black architect admitted to the Texas Institution for Architects. And he was also instrumental in establishing an association of black architects here in the United States. Downs Field is named for Carl E. Downs, who was a president of Samuel Houston College back in the 1940s. Anyway, Downs Field is today, this is the field where the Houston Tillerson Rams baseball team plays now. Now, this was also a field, this field also saw where Negro baseball teams played. A number of Negro baseball teams played here, including the Austin Black Pioneers, the Austin Black Senators. Also, the Brooklyn Eagles played here, and the Homestead Grays. Those were the Brooklyn Eagles, and the Homestead Grays were part of the Negro baseball leagues. So you would have seen players such as Buck O'Neil here. You would have seen players like Willie Wells here. Willie Wells, by the way, was an Austinite, a baseball player in the National Negro Leagues, and he was known as El Diablo because he was so fast. He was so fast like the devil. And he played exhibition games when in Central America, as well as in Mexico, when the Negro Baseball League season had ended. He did a lot of exhibition games, but he was a well-known baseball player with the Negro Leagues. He would have played here at Downs Field, and he is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he was a native Austinite. Now, as I said, the Houston Tillerson Rams still play here. Come out and see a game. with the Houston Tillerson Rams baseball team in the springtime. I was just told that it's at free admission into the stadium to see the Rams play. Now, efforts are being made to renovate Downs Field to make it more accessible, more inviting to the city. The coach here, there was a program given here last year at Downs Field dedicated to raising funds for the renovation of Downs Field and also to introduce more Austinites to Downs Field and its importance as well. The coach of the Houston Tillerson Rams baseball team still comes out here with his riding mower, and he takes care of the grounds around the pitcher's mound. So hands-on, very, very personable, as is and very inviting as Downs Field is on a day when there is a baseball game, and it will become more inviting in the future. Now, something about Carl Downs. Carl Downs, as I said, was president of Samuel Houston College in the 1940s. Carl Downs was a graduate of Samuel Houston College. Well, Carl Downs brought in 1943 a young man who was just got out of the Army after being stationed at Fort Hood up in Killeen, came out of the Army, and he talked this man, persuaded this man to come to Samuel Houston College and to coach the basketball team and the track team. Now, sometimes the basketball team was undermanned, and he would put himself into the game in order to play basketball with his fellow teammates. Apparently, rules were a little bit looser back in those days than now. Now, this same minister, Carl Downs, went on to officiate at the marriage, the wedding of this athlete to his wife. Now, this particular athlete went on to make a name for himself nationally in 1947. In 1947, he signed on, I'm giving it away now, he signed on with the Brooklyn Dodgers, changing baseball history forever. Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson, exactly. Well, Jackie Robinson spent time here in Austin. Now, we used to say, people wondered, well, did Jackie Robinson ever play baseball here? No, he never played baseball here, but we're pretty sure that he walked across the field here because he kept a relationship with the combined Houston Tillerson College, later University, after he made it to the big league. Of the establishment of the Negro District in 1928. Rosewood Park dates from about 1930. There was already a structure over here in Rosewood Park. There's a house on the hill, a two-story house called the Hippert's House, and that was built about 1867. To let you know that there were Germans already in this neighborhood in the 1860s. Well, anyway, the Hippert's family donated the house to the city for Rosewood Park. Now, also here in Rosewood Park, you can see that there's a little cabin on the hill. Well, that little cabin is the Henry G. Madison cabin, and Henry G. Madison was a free black who moved to Austin in 1863 during the Civil War, and he built that little cabin about 1867. Now, also, not only was Mr. Madison a free black, but he was also a farmer and he was a businessman as well. So he built this little cabin in 1867 on what is now East 11th Street. And then as his family grew, the cabin was enclosed in a wooden structure. The reason why the cabin was enclosed in a wooden structure is because eventually Mr. and Mrs. Madison had about 8 daughters. Now imagine raising a whole family inside there. Talk about boundary spaces. So a larger home was created by enclosing a cabin in a larger wooden structure. In 1969, 1967, the wooden structure was being demolished when the little cabin was uncovered within the larger structure. So the little cabin was saved by a Mrs. Wooten, and then it was brought over here about 1973 and dedicated to the city. This is where it has been ever since. Also over here on the grounds we have Doris Miller Auditorium. Doris Miller Auditorium dates to 1944, and this was at a time when the city was trying to provide some services. They had a Negro Association for recreation, and so Doris Miller Auditorium is a result of that. Now, Doris Miller Auditorium is named for Doris Miller. Some say Dory Miller, and Mr. Miller was one of the first heroes of Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, he was on the Arizona when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And he was a messman in the Navy, and he was credited with shooting down 2 Japanese Zeros. Some say that he shot down as many as 5, but he was cited for shooting down 2 Zeros, and this was a man who was not trained to fire a gun, in fact didn't fire guns prior to his enlistment in the Navy. For that, he was decorated with the Navy Cross by Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was in the Pacific and also a Texan. Think of Fredericksburg, that's where he was from, Fredericksburg. Doris Miller himself was lost at sea in 1943 and is still missing and presumed dead now. It's still not official that he is dead. Doris Miller Auditorium has been the site of many celebrations through the years. It too was on the Chitlin circuit, if you will. Joe Tex once performed there. Dinah Washington performed there through the years. There were graduations there. Even the Austin Symphony Orchestra had a concert there at Doris Miller Auditorium in 1948. Today, I remember going there about a few months ago on a Monday, and there was a badminton game going on over there. There are public meetings held. They have a nice stage in Doris Miller Auditorium. I highly recommend that you go and check out Doris Miller. Well, that young man won a special election in 1937, and one of the ways that he won was by appealing directly to the African American vote here in Austin. And he won to be the U.S. Congressman representing Austin and the Hill Country. Well, this young man was an ardent New Dealer, so he was a great friend of Franklin Roosevelt and knew of how the worth of the New Deal and how it was transforming America and how it could further transform Texas and Austin, especially, well, his district. Anyway, he petitioned the federal government to establish housing here in Austin. And so in 1939, Rosewood Courts across the street opened in 1939. This is the first federal housing project in the United States. Now, Rosewood Court from 1939 was intended to be racially integrated from the very, very start. In fact, the congressman wanted it integrated, but the city of Austin, the city fathers, did not want to see this integrated because, and in the Negro district, after all, I mean, you know, we can't have that commingling of the races, and, you know, we don't want to give these people some funny ideas. So, Rosewood Courts was established in 1939, and then in 1940 and in 1942, 2 other public housing projects were established here in Austin, but they grew out of Rosewood. One was Chalmers Court, and the other one was the Santa Rita Court. Chalmers Court was for white people, the Santa Rita Court was for black people.
No, Mexican-American.
Mexican-American people, I'm sorry. All right, now, that congressman who was so instrumental in getting federal housing established, especially here in Austin, was none other than Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. Remember his campaign of '64? You may have read about it, LBJ for the USA. LBJ was for the USA back in the 1930s and onward. So you're looking at the first federally funded housing project, the oldest one in the United States of America. A real cultural asset here in East Austin.
Look here, what you doing? We have a new Joseph.
Yes. Well, anyway, folks, we mentioned earlier at the beginning of this, of the ride, that there were a number of freedmen's towns established here in Austin after the Civil War. And we are actually, behind you is one such freedmen's town, Gregorytown. Right behind you, Gregorytown. Gregorytown was established after the Civil War, and Gregorytown pretty well existed until, let's say, maybe the 1920s, maybe a little bit before that. So Gregorytown, a number of assets over here, including what is now Huston-Tillotson University. This started out in 1881 as Tillotson Institute in 1881, but prior to that, the land was purchased in 1877. Dr. George Tillotson, who was a minister with the Congregationalist Church, was in this area and looking for a institution for higher learning for African American people. And he came across this spot here, which originally was known as Bluebonnet Hill, and he went back to his board, and they decided to charter a school in this area. The school was chartered 1877, but it did not open its doors until 1881. And that was Tillotson Institute, named for Dr. George B. Tillotson, or the Reverend Dr. George B. Tillotson. Anyway, Tillotson College grew. At one point, Tillotson Institute became Tillotson College. At one point, they had a black female president of the school, one of only two black female presidents of institutions for higher learning in the 1930s. We had one right here. In fact, the gymnasium is named for her, for some of you folks who are familiar with Huston-Tillotson. Anyway, though, so then 1952, Samuel Houston College merged with Tillotson College to form Huston-Tillotson College, and now Huston-Tillotson University. There are at least two structures on this campus that are in the National Register of Historic Places. One is the Bayer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the Bayer Hall. It's the building that is a white stucco building, two-story, and it's a prairie-style building. Anyway, that was built 1914, reflecting the kind of the prairie style. Think of Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's in the National Register of Historic Places. And then there's another building on the campus that is also listed, and that is Ira Evans Hall. What makes Evans Hall significant is that Evans Hall was built in part by students. Back in the days, from the 1870s through the early 1900s, when industrial education was taught, there was a big debate over what should you teach African Americans. Should you teach them a liberal education or an industrial education? And anyway, Tillotson had a little bit of both. So they had an industrial education department, and so the bricks for that school, for that particular building, were made in part by the students. So, and that is one of the few student-built buildings that you'll find on any campus, any African-American campus in America. Also about Ira Evans Hall, Ira Evans himself. Ira Evans was from Vermont. Ira Evans fought for the Union, and he was in the honor guard at Lincoln's funeral in 1865. Came to Texas, headed the Freedmen's Bureau briefly, was elected to the Texas House of Representatives, became Speaker of the House, resigned soon after that and made his money in the railroads, came back to Austin, and he was on the board of trustees of Tillotson from, I think, 1912 until about 1920. Ira Evans. If you ever go over to the Bremond Block, some of you might be familiar with the Bremond Block, a block of historic 19th century homes in downtown Austin near the Austin History Center. There is a huge house that looks like a castle. Well, anyway, that is the Evans North Chateau, or the North Evans Chateau, and that was owned by Ira Evans. Since 1929, it has been the headquarters for the Austin Women's Club.
Oh.
So even Ira Evans has a very important play in the development of Tillotson, of Houston-Tillotson. Like I said, in '52, these schools merged to form Houston-Tillotson College, now Houston-Tillotson University, and the buildings have names that are hyphenated to reflect the dual heritage of Samuel Houston as well as of Blackshear Elementary School, or Blackshear School, right across the way over there, as she said. Blackshear School is one of the oldest African American schools here in Austin, and it was named for an educator, a black educator named Edward A. Blackshear. Anyway, the current school. Go ahead. Oh, good. All right, excellent. Good. Keep me on track. She's my fact checker here. She's my fact checker. And Blackshear started out as the Gregorytown School in the 1880s. All right, good. I need a fact checker here. But anyway, Mr. Blackshear went on to stay in the education system for years. In fact, he went on, if I'm right, to be the head of Prairie View. Okay, good. All right, excellent. The current structure of Blackshear dates from 1936. It's a great example of the Art Moderne style, popular in the 1930s, a successor to Art Deco. Okay, then. All right. You're very, very proud of your school. And what is it called again? And later he became a comptroller of the state of Texas. Well, he eventually developed cancer, unfortunately, and it was terminal cancer. And so he was looking for a place where he could be buried. Right, so anyway, though, he was looking for a place where he could be buried. And he was entitled to be buried in this certain place because he had been a state official. Well, he came out to look at the cemetery, and he hated how the cemetery looked. It was in deplorable condition. And so he got the Texas legislature to appropriate funds for the redevelopment of that cemetery. All right. And then, not only that, and did he get funds to refurbish the cemetery because he figured that it would be an ideal place, the fitting place for him to be buried in, but he also got the Texas legislature to speak with the Texas congressional delegation in Washington for more funding for the development of the cemetery. Now, he also managed to get the congressional delegation as a way of getting federal funding for the development of the cemetery, got the government to declare a road through that cemetery as a highway so that it could get federal funding as well as more state funding for the development, which ended up not only developing the highway, but also developing the cemetery itself. Well, that state official was Bob Bullock. And the cemetery is the cemetery that we're in today called Oakwood Cemetery. I'm sorry, the Texas State Cemetery. All that pushing, good. Yeah, so the Texas State Cemetery. All right then. Now, that highway through the cemetery is what you're on right now. This is the shortest highway in Texas, in fact, in the United States, if not the world. This is Texas State Highway 165 through the Texas State Cemetery.
Oh my God.
That's right. There's a sign right there at the entrance. Now, in the Texas State Cemetery, notable Texans from various walks of life, especially Texas government, are buried here, but some exceptions have been made. One of the exceptions made was, well, Willie James Wells over there. El Diablo is buried here in the Texas State Cemetery. That's him right over there. Do you see the big tombstone that reads Wells? W-E-L-L-S?
It's got a baseball
Stand
player
up.
on it.
Do you see it now?
Yeah. It's
The
got a
baseball player.
It's got the bronze plaque.
You'll see it.
You
All
figured
right.
it out.
Okay, very good. Excellent. So Willie Wells is buried over there. Here's one of the exceptions to the rule. Now, also, there is another person buried here, notable, and she was the first person to be buried here in the first black person buried here in the Texas State Cemetery, and her name is Barbara Jordan.
Cool.
Barbara Jordan is buried here up on the high point called Monument Hill. She's buried there. There's been another black person buried here in the cemetery of note, and her name was Myra McDaniel. Myra McDaniel was the first black Texas Secretary of State. Myra McDaniel. I knew her well, by the way. And I also met Barbara Jordan on occasion. And also what makes Barbara Jordan significant is that Barbara Jordan was the first black person in the 20th century elected to the Texas Senate. When she was first elected to the Texas Senate in 1966, not only the first black person elected to the Senate in the 20th century, but also the first black woman elected to the Texas Senate, and that was in 1966. She went on to stand for election in a newly created congressional district, becoming, if I'm right, the first black woman from the South sent to the United States Congress. And then she was placed on the House Judiciary Committee. She wanted to get on that committee, so she got to be on that committee. She made a name for herself in 1974 while the House Judiciary Committee was investigating whether or not to bring articles of impeachment against President Richard Nixon. What people remember about her is that she made a great speech while on the committee in which she said, among other things, the Constitution is real. It is a real living document, and we're going to, in thinking about that and applying that towards whether or not to vote for articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. She went on to become the first black woman to address a major national convention when she addressed the Democratic National Convention in 1976. After an illustrious career in Congress, she retired and became a teacher, a professor at the LBJ School for Public Affairs. She's buried here. Also, too, her portrait was unveiled in the Texas Senate in about 1977, 1978. If you've ever been to the state capitol and been to the Texas Senate, you can see her portrait there. There's also a monument to her on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin. I like the fact that that monument stands right across the street from the home of Major General George Washington Littlefield, a major benefactor of the university and one who vowed that black people would never enter the University of Texas.
Question.
I was about to say.
Harrison, have a question?
Yes.
Over here, are those just Texas veterans?
Those are Civil War veterans.
Oh, Civil War.
Civil War veterans and mostly Confederate veterans
Okay.
buried there. There are a few Union veterans buried here, but mostly Confederate veterans buried here in the Texas State Cemetery. There's even a Revolutionary War veteran buried here. He would have been extremely old by that time. And since then, veterans from all the wars have been are buried here in this cemetery.
So this is the veteran cemetery.
This is
For
the veterans
Austin.
part. This is
For
the
Austin.
veterans part
For
of the
Austin.
text. On your way out of the cemetery, there are two important monuments to your right. One is commemorating the Texans who died on 9/11. Those Texans who died at New York, at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and also in that field in Pennsylvania. It also lists the timeline as to when the planes hit the World Trade Center, when they hit the Pentagon, and the plane that went down in the field in Pennsylvania. It is built of granite, Texas granite, as well as beams taken from ground zero. That is on your right-hand side, and then beyond that, there is a black granite tablet commemorating those black Texans who served in the Texas legislature between the years 1868 and 1900.
Okay, that's on the right side?
That'll be on your right-hand side on our way out on the shortest highway in Texas. Here, right where we're standing now, and he built a small house here about 1879, 1880. This is the original size of the house, and this was where he and his wife, this is where they raised their family. Well, the house was added to through the years by the Hamiltons, and by, 2005, the house was really in a condition of where they were thinking about tearing it down. But fortunately, wiser heads prevailed. I believe that Lisa was one of those wiser heads that managed to persuade people that this was a cultural asset that was worth saving. And so this portion of the property was saved and refurbished, and it is now the Dietrich Hamilton House for Mr. Dietrich and for a Hamilton as well. All right, so now, this is all part of the African American Cultural and Heritage Facility right there. And right behind here, we have this mural, this tile mural, and we also have these photographic blocks representing famous African Americans here in Austin.
Was this done by Yancy?
Excuse me?
Was this done by Yancy?
No.
No, this was not done by Yancey. This was not done by Yancey. I'm just going to point out a few African Americans here. We have A.Z. Taylor Morton. A.Z. Taylor Morton was a graduate of Houston-Tillotson University, and also she was the first black treasurer of the United States. She was appointed by President Jimmy Carter, the first black treasurer of the United States from Austin, Texas. Also, there's Ella Phillips right there. You see here. You can see Myra McDaniel up there. We have Earl Campbell.
Yeah.
Earl Campbell. Earl Campbell, one of the first blacks to play on the University of Texas Longhorn football team, and the first Longhorn to win the Heisman Trophy.
And yes, he is known for sausages.
Yes, he is known for sausages. Yes, he is known for sausages.
Played pro ball.
Huh? Yes, he went on to play pro ball also for the Houston Oilers. Yes, in fact, they called it the Houston Hurlers because he was so well known there.
And then sweat.
Also, we have Heman Sweat. We have Heman Marion Sweat. There we go. Heman Sweat right here. Heman Sweat was the man who filed a lawsuit against the University of Texas in 1944 because he was denied admittance to the University of Texas School of Law. Well, anyway, he sued the president of the University of Texas, Theophilus S. Painter, in a case which became Sweat versus Painter, where the case was first argued in Travis County at the Travis County Courthouse downtown on Guadalupe, and he lost. The case was lost there. So he and his attorney appealed and went to a higher court, and it made its way up all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court in 1950 in Sweat versus Painter ruled that the University of Texas had to admit African Americans. There was a school that was established for African Americans who wanted to go to law school, but it was judged inferior. So the university had to admit him in 1950, and this began the desegregation of institutions of higher learning, of huge southern institutions of higher learning. This began the move to desegregate them in the South, and that was also, they graduated John L. Chase in 1952, and we saw evidence of his work when we were at David Chapel, and we saw the Della Phillips house. Now, the courthouse where this case was first argued, the Travis County Courthouse on Guadalupe, is now the Heman Marion Sweat Travis County Courthouse. Now,
And who tried that?
Now, does anybody know the name of the attorney who represented Heman Sweat, who tried the case first here in Travis County?
I can't.
Anybody know?
No, it certainly wouldn't have been him.
Back guess.
That would be fun.
Anybody know
He knows.
the name of the attorney? Who's
Thurgood.
Thurgood Marshall? All right then. It was Thurgood Marshall.
And we should add that Sweat, of course, was previous to Brown versus Board.
That
Right?
is correct.
So many people people see it as a precursor and an important precursor. The law isn't very direct, but an important precursor in terms of desegregation of schools across the
That's right. And also that case was argued by Thurgood Marshall.
Absolutely.
Thurgood Marshall was such an illustrious attorney and later an illustrious jurist. He argued 33 cases before the United States Supreme Court. And guess what? He won 29 of those cases before the Supreme Court.
Maybe that's why they let him off. They're like, well, since you already live here.
He went on to become Solicitor General under President Kennedy, I believe, and then went on to become a jurist on the U.S. Court of Appeals. And then in 1967, he was nominated by President Lyndon Johnson to become an associate justice on the Supreme Court. Yeah. Also, we have Doris Miller listed right here. Remember when I spoke to you about Doris Miller?
Yes.
Exactly, yes. And Doris Miller Auditorium, he was from Waco, Texas originally, stationed on the USS Arizona. He was there on December 7th, 1941. Even though he was not trained to shoot down planes, he shot down, credited with shooting down 2 Japanese Zeros, though some say that he shot down 5 Japanese Zeros. He is the one who has been missing and presumed dead since 1943. He was assigned to another ship, yes. And also the first white man, if I'm right, to win the Navy Cross also for his services. We also have another person here, and another person whom I knew personally, Ron Kirk.
Why do you say new? Like,
Well, Ron Kirk went to John H. Reagan High School.
no.
I went to Reagan High School.
And you did too. I went to LBJ.
Yes,
That's
I
right.
see. You were one of the LBJ First Ladies, I guess. Yes, right? That's what we call the drill team. But Ron Kirk, I knew Ron Kirk. He was the first. He was the first white mayor of Dallas, Texas. Went on to serve in posts in the Bill Clinton administration and in President Obama's administration as well. His mother was Willie Mae Kirk, for which there is a library. The Oak Springs Public Library is now the Willie Mae Kirk Public Library. She had a home over in Holy Cross Heights. And if I'm right, her husband, W. Astor Kirk, who was a noted civil rights leader here in Austin, is the man who led the fight to desegregate Austin Public Library in 1949.